Pardon me while I get myself situated. I have some details I don't want to miss, so I might use my notes a little more than I normally do today. I wonder if you remember when people bought millions upon millions of records. We're all probably old enough to remember that. The real heyday of people purchasing LP records, the 12-inch vinyl kind that are suddenly back in style, was in the 1970s. A whole lot of the best-selling records ever were released during that time, in the 70s and then into the early 80s. And records just seemed, I don't know if you remember, but you could buy records and then you could buy either 8-tracks. There's somebody watching on the internet right now that has no idea what an 8-track is, or cassettes. And a lot of people buy cassettes. I liked the records better. I wanted to buy a record, and I wanted to, if I took it in the car or I wanted to walk around and listen to it, I'd put it on a cassette, record it onto one, and then just listen that way. But records were my thing. I still have hundreds of them. Okay, I still have most of the records that I ever got. Big fan. Then what happened was, a couple of big Japanese companies got together and said, you know what? We can make music sound better, make it more portable, and they came up with this idea that was the compact disc in the early 80s. Here's a fun little piece of trivia. Can anybody guess what the first pop compact disc ever released was? Anybody remember? I know the answer because I used Google before I got here. No, I already knew this answer. It was actually Billy Joel, 52nd Street. Was the very first pop record ever converted to CD. Suddenly we were all buying CDs. I worked in a Christian bookstore during this time, from the early 80s through the end of the 80s. And I kind of saw there for a while, suddenly people were buying fewer records, and then boom. We literally just got rid of them completely. And then people started buying CDs. If you'll look up here, it's kind of hard to see on this graph, but the green and the red is all you need to see. The green and the blue is where it kind of fell off, and then the red is where people started buying CDs. You'll notice when you get closer to today, they fell off again. People stopped investing in something that no longer had a return on investment. They weren't buying records anymore because they had a CD player. Stores weren't buying them anymore. Slowly but surely, all the record plants shut down. Of course, now a bunch of them open again. But that's another story. That's a little bit of nostalgia. So now CDs had the same thing happen. They go up, and suddenly people are buying tons of them, and then suddenly they're not buying them as much. Because we got these things. First, we got those little iPods and MP3 players, and now it's all built into your phone. Your phone, which has replaced your computer. It's replaced your regular flip phone. It's replaced everything, and people stopped investing in those physical things. In fact, people are buying fewer CDs in 2019 than they were buying the second or third year that they were available when they were brand new. It's just, and the people that make them obviously have just not put money into it. It's a little bit like a lot of things in life that we simply change over time and maybe even abandoned. Let's say you have two cars. One is a 20-year-old clunker, and one is 5 years old, 2 years old. At some point, the 20-year-old clunker is going to be a car that you can no longer put money into because it costs more than just buying a new car. And by the way, you shouldn't buy a new car until you reach that point, should you? That's what they all tell you. Drive it until the sides are rusting off. But at some point, we have a expression that I always love called, at one point we stopped throwing good money after bad. In other words, okay, I'm not going to fix this thing because fact of the matter is, it's just going to start costing me more money to fix it than it would for a new car. I got to that point with my Jeep last year, and it was a 1999, and it just was not built to last 20 years. So I ended up getting a car that was not going to cost me money all the time. We do the same kind of thing sometimes, though, in business with investments. One of the places that I drive going back and forth to some of the jobs that I do in my work is Eastgate over here on obviously the east side of Cincinnati. And there's this giant store closing sign on the Sears there. Who would have thought you'd ever live in a time when you were in a town where there were no Sears? But I believe that's the last one in this area. When it goes, Sears is gone from here. At some point, people simply stopped investing money or putting effort or putting energy into something that simply wasn't working anymore. Sadly. Or in some cases, not sadly. Anytime that you're in business, you're at some point going to look at the different ways you're spending money and say, we got to stop doing this. The people that used to manufacture cassettes don't do that anymore. Maybe even some of them went out of business because people weren't going to put money into it anymore. Unfortunately, sometimes we do this in relationships. Now, sometimes that's a good thing. If a relationship is toxic, it's time to stop investing in it. For us as people. It just is. Or maybe at least for a season. But sometimes maybe we don't necessarily stop investing in relationships for a good reason. But regardless of that, at some point we might not even just necessarily be negative on it. We simply stopped investing in it and we realized, gosh, I haven't talked to so-and-so in 2 years. Maybe I should. Or maybe that's a good thing. It does depend, doesn't it? We have a little bit of that kind of thinking or that kind of evaluation of relationships and investments in this parable of the vineyard today. But I want to give you a little bit of sense of a few things linguistically about it. The parable of the vineyard, you could call it, because it is a parable, even though it's Old Testament. But this song is kind of interesting. If you look at the structure of it, it's structured a lot like an ancient song, like a wedding song. Think of it as a wedding song, at least at the beginning. In fact, when you consider the whole thing and the fact that everything goes badly and the vineyard stops producing grapes and the person that keeps the vineyard decides he's just going to tear it down, it starts to sound like a really sad song. Maybe it's a bad country song. A few years ago, no lie, I had a bad stretch for a few weeks where I lost a job, and then my car broke down, and then one of my dogs died. And I said to my wife, we're a bad country song. The truck, everything, it all works together. But maybe it's another kind of song that I looked at it, I thought maybe it's a little bit like somebody standing up at a wedding and giving a toast, but instead of toasting, and you've been to a wedding where maybe the best man gives a toast, or maybe one spouse toasts the other spouse, or something like that. We have these toasts. And think of this song as a toast. Only, let's say this person stands up and starts singing a Taylor Swift song. So it's a pop song toast. And then just like most Taylor Swift songs, it ends up being about a really horrible relationship. No offense to Taylor Swift. But, that's what all her songs are about, pretty much. About how bad her relationships are. So this is the Bible's bad Taylor Swift country song wedding toast. That's what this is. Now, there's some linguistic tricks in here that do not translate into English, but are so important to understanding what's going on that I kind of want to share them. And that's one of the reasons I really need my notes, because I don't really know Hebrew at all. So, but there's a trick here I really want you to understand. But first, I want to talk about the importance of the little things in language. I think this will give you an idea of how important it is. I talked early about how you could take the same words that say lived and say devil. In fact, I think if you just turn the word around, lived becomes devil. Same letters, completely different meaning. Let's take it even further. What happens if we just take away one piece of punctuation? No doubt you've heard this one. For instance, let's eat, Grandma. That little comma between eat and grandma is really important, because without it we have let's eat, Grandma. Same sentence, one little thing missing makes all the difference in the world. It's a little bit like what happens at the end of this passage. And I want to sort of keep this out so that I can see it. We have this word play at the very end. And this is the reason that God has decided to stop investing in this relationship. Because it starts off as a song about basically a married couple, and he's comparing, basically it's an analogy. God is the one keeping the vineyard, and Israel is sort of the spouse. This is where we get a lot of our idea for the Song of Solomon being an allegory for God's love for his people. So we have that relationship, but God stops investing in the relationship, or at least says that that's what's going to happen. But at the very end, the last few couple verses, the last one verse really, show exactly why this is happening. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? When I expected it to yield grapes, I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong one. The very end, the very last one. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah are his pleasant planting. Here's where it is. He expected justice, but saw bloodshed. Righteousness, but heard a cry. Here's what you don't get from that. And I want to show you some Hebrew letters. Okay? Let's talk about the word justice. This is the word mishpat. What happens if I change just one letter in the word justice? I see the word mishpak, which is disobedience, or in this particular case, it's translated bloodshed. One little letter. So God's doing this little play on words. And then for the other one is fairness is tzedakah, which one translation says fairness, and this translation here is righteousness. Change one letter and you have tzedakah, a cry for help. One little letter. There's a couple lessons here I think that God's trying to give us. One thing that's kind of helpful for understanding this, I recently ran across a new translation of the Old Testament that I'm really enjoying by a guy named Robert Alter. It is a very Jewish translation. It's just the Old Testament. And he decides he's going to try to actually bring the wordplay into English. So he translates it like this. He hoped for justice and, look, jaundice. For righteousness and, look, wretchedness. The idea is, and here's why I think we want to see why this is important, because when we get in the middle of our situations in life, sometimes the two things look really similar, or they're really hard to figure out, or we've allowed our own stunted and bruised and belittled conscience to simply say, you know what, let's just say that's okay. When we're on the job and the best way to get ahead is to cheat somebody else. Maybe that's okay. I'm providing for my family. Bible says I should do that. Has to be a good thing. Or you fill in the blank of some way that in a relationship, whether that's personal, whether that's business, whether that's a relationship with God, we find ourselves able to make excuses for why it's okay to go the path we're going. Really, it's fine. We convince ourselves of this. Remember, these people of both Israel and Judah, last week we were talking about Israel. This week, Isaiah is talking to Judah, the southern kingdom. These people have convinced themselves that it is really okay to follow the wisdom of the world or the religions of the people around them and mix it in with their own faith to the point where you can't tell the two apart. It reminds me of the constant admonition that I very often hear from Christian thinkers or leaders. How are we as people who follow Jesus Christ different from someone who doesn't? What makes us different? And obviously in the case of these people that Isaiah is preaching to, not very much. Maybe nothing at all. And although this should give us pause, and although this should slow us down and make us evaluate, for many people, we simply dig our heels in and just say, well, I'm convinced that this is the right way to go, and I'm simply going to do it. We've all heard people make excuses for ways that they behave, or ways that they live. I've heard people make excuses for marital affairs. Oh no, I really think that this is what God wants. Really? Can you show me chapter and verse on that? Or more subtle things. The story of the way that we treat our children or our spouse, where we know that we're supposed to hold them higher than ourselves. And I'm not saying we can be perfect. I know that we can't. But I would like to think this kind of preaching from Isaiah and in any of the prophets, or so many of the stories of the Old Testament where people make compromises and it ends up being disastrous, would show us, maybe I should look at this differently. Maybe if I know that I shouldn't eat fatty foods all the time, maybe when I go out to dinner or lunch, maybe I'll change my way of thinking about the way I feed the very temple of God that God has given me. The very house of God that God has created so that God can walk on this planet living in me. Maybe I'll take care of that better. One of the things that can be dangerous when we start to go down this road is we start to think, okay, if we're that vineyard, then here's this parable of God. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to actually stop taking care of the vineyard. I'm not going to throw any more good money after bad. I'm not going to invest in this anymore. In fact, I'm going to cause it so it won't even rain on it. It won't even rain on the vineyard. And then nothing will grow. It'll be horrible. I'm just going to cut it off. It's really important that we remember that that's not where God leaves it. It's not where God leaves it at all. And it's funny, in the narrative lectionary for today, there are two passages from Isaiah. We only read the first one because I wanted to save the second one. Because God talks about what is possible in that first one in Isaiah 5. Look, you're all a vineyard. The people of God are a vineyard. And you've proven that you're not worth investing in anymore because you've taken what is good, or you've taken the possibilities of doing good and turned them into possibilities of doing evil. You've twisted righteousness into bloodshed. You've literally taken one letter and changed it and made it so that you can justify in your own mind behaving and living in ways that are simply not the ways of following God. So what I can do is I can just eliminate it all. Remember, this is the same God about whom is told the story of Noah. Maybe people, as they're thinking of this, are thinking, God, that's denying the rain there is a little bit like flooding the earth and just killing everybody, isn't it? So we're reminded that this is the God who has a power to do this. But maybe they also remember that Noah received a promise that would never happen again. Noah received a promise from God, God saying, okay, I'm going to put myself in a box. I'm going to limit myself. I'm going to promise never to do that again, which means now there's something that's possible for me that I won't do. And God goes further than that as we get to chapter 11, which is the second half of today's reading. And we hear a promise that may be familiar to those of you who've been listening to Scripture in church for all your lives. From chapter 11 of Isaiah, a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. Now imagine, if you will, a stump of a vine in a vineyard that's been denied water and has not been tended. There's that stump. There's nothing but a stump. It's just everything has been abandoned. But a shoot will come from that stump. And from those roots, a branch will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, the Spirit of the knowledge and fear of the Lord, and he will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes, which is really good for you and me, by the way, or decide by what he hears with his ears, but with righteousness. Remember the righteousness that got twisted? Now it's getting twisted back into shape. Righteousness, he will judge the needy. With justice, he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. I want to stop there because it's not my main point. But every single time we talk about righteousness and justice in the Bible, we should think of passages like this. Because when we think of righteousness as people, as humans in the 21st century, we think righteousness is somebody who lives a great life and does great things. We think of justice as the bad guy getting what he deserves. With righteousness, he will judge the needy. And with justice, he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. God's idea of justice and righteousness is always good news for the poor. And if it isn't, it's not the good news of Jesus. God's understanding of what justice and righteousness are is always good news, liberating, freeing, restoring, redeeming news for the poor. That's what it is. And if it isn't, it is not the gospel of Jesus Christ. So if we're poor, we're kind of lucky. Which is probably why Jesus said we should be poor in spirit. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth. Doesn't need to use his hands, doesn't need to use a weapon. Just the words that come. With the breath of his lips, he will slay the wicked. Again, doesn't even need a sword. Righteousness, remember what righteousness means. Righteousness will be his belt, and faithfulness the sash around his waist. And then there comes a beautiful passage here that will also probably be familiar. The wolf will live with the lamb. That's kind of impossible. The leopard will lie down with the goat, the calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child will lead them. The cow will feed with the bear, their young will lie down together. The lion will eat straw like the ox. The infant will play near the cobra's den. The young child will put its hand into the viper's nest. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. One of the main point I want us to take from Isaiah today is that yes, God has the power, God has the ability, God even has the right, and in some people's views, the responsibility to look at the vineyard of our life that is sometimes just such a wreck because we're unable to follow God in the way that we should. And he looks, and I almost get tired of saying this, except it's such good news that maybe I don't. He looks at the mess that is that life. He looks at the vineyard that is producing sour grapes that you can't even make wine from. He looks at all that. He looks at your life. He looks at my life. God looks at that and says, I can work with that. I can restore that. I can redeem that. I can make that brand new. I can actually work out my purposes, my plan in this world with those flawed and broken people. With people like Saul, who is a murderous, persecuting force against the people of God, and says, I can work with this. People like Peter, who doesn't even understand at one point in the book of Acts, doesn't even understand what's going on with this whole the gospel is for everybody thing, and he won't associate with Gentiles. And God says, no, I can use, not only am I going to take my gospel to them, but Peter, I can even use you. You always mess up. You always screw up. You always say the wrong thing. I can use that. God looks into your life, looks into where you've been, what you have become, the way that you have failed, and the way that you've messed up, and says, I can redeem that. I can restore that. A stump sitting there, but doesn't matter. A new branch is going to come up. A new branch is going to come up because my spirit lives in this beloved child of God. Let us never forget that we as beloved children of God are part of a reality, a reign, a kingdom that is about restoration and redemption and taking those ways that we fail and making us new again, useful again, and important and beloved in the eyes of God always.